All right. Let me adjust this. Check. 1, 2, check. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So today we're going to be looking at... Well, actually, let me turn this down so it's not echoey. Okay, so today we are going to be taking a look at the age of Realpolitik, which is the period of time roughly from about 1850 up to about 1880, somewhere in there, 1875 maybe. And talking a little bit about the age of Realpolitik, basically, the age of Realpolitik is characterized by essentially three things. Number one, Otto von Bismarck. Okay, like he's the number one quintessential figure of the age of Realpolitik. He exemplifies everything that the style of governance changes to in the latter half of the 19th century, which is professional politicians governing affairs rather than, say, noble-born politicians or something like that. Now, it's not to say that Europe in general doesn't have a number of different nobles that are still in high-ranking positions within society. Certainly they do. But increasingly, as the Industrial Revolution time has waged on, the style of governance changes, and the social structure of Europe changes, so that your upper middle class bourgeois kind of become liberals become a very significant voice in the realm of governing, particularly in England. But Otto von Bismarck is a conservative, and he cracks down on kind of the liberal voice. They're more or less kept completely quiet. They tacitly support Bismarck, actually, because you actually have a growing sizable part of the population down in Germany, which is unified under Bismarck. That's one of the major things that he accomplishes. You have this growing voice of socialists in Germany and across Europe, but particularly the socialists are way scary to the liberals at this time. Okay. Those two terms have a tendency in modern day politics to kind of be associated with one another, for better or for worse. But in those times, liberals, remember, are going to be classical liberals. They're laissez-faire, free market liberals. They don't want to see a bunch of government interference in the economy. And the liberals they're kept in check by Bismarck because they'd rather support Bismarck than radical socialists. Let me pull up a thing here so that I have some notes that I can use to guide our review. Let's see here. Resources, group, ERHS, AP Euro, and Age of Realpolitik. Okay, let's see, here it is. 1848 to 1871. Now, one thing that I mentioned last online lecture is that the art movement also changes during this time from being romantic style art, which kind of focused on like ancient rustic scenes or like feudal rustic scenes in Europe. Remember that they didn't have like movies or anything back in those days, so art was a form of escapism, and the kind of the horrors, I guess you would say, of the Industrial Revolution left people longing for a reconnection to nature, which is what a big part of Romanticism is all about, is connecting with nature. Let's see here. I'm going to have to do this. Okay. So the age of Realpolitik. The main theme of the age of Realpolitik is that nationalism becomes married to this idea of conservatism, and a lot of this comes out of the failures of the revolutions of 1848. So when we talk about like Germany, there was that humiliation of Olmütz under Frederick William IV, who said, I would not accept a crown from the gutter. I refuse to accept a crown from the gutter, and instead claims to rule over Germany or Prussia using divine right. So the humiliation of Olmütz was definitely a blow in the short term to German unification. Austria, the question of Austria, whether Austria would join in the unification of a German state, was also another factor, and they would only accept a plan for German unity if Prussia accepted the leadership of the German Bund, the German Confederacy, which Austria dominated, and they wouldn't do that. So this is going to put a strain on the efforts to unify Germany. So Prussia steps back, okay, at that time. Austria, 1848. Hungarian forces led by Louis Kossuth went to war against Austria. And the Austrian army, with the help of various ethnic minorities, helped to defeat the Hungarians and preserve the empire there. So there was a failed Hungarian revolution. In France, the February Revolution resulted in the overthrow of Louis Philippe and established the Second French Republic led by Alphonse Lamartine. And that's when you see the June Days Revolution, which pitted the bourgeoisie against the working class and conservatives, who were supported by the army, to restore order. And then Louis Napoleon, who was a conservative, was elected president overwhelmingly shortly thereafter. So in France, you might say that they actually were relatively successful. The emergence of Realpolitik after 1848. So the failure of the revolutions of 1848 for liberals and romantics demonstrated that strong idealism is not enough to accomplish revolutionary goals. You need to change up tactics. So the age of realism replaces romanticism as the dominant philosophy after 1850. And a political outgrowth of realism as an art movement is the notion of realpolitik, the accomplishing of one's political goals via practical means rather than having idealism drive your political decisions, right? A new political era emerges after 1848 where nationalist goals now are being achieved using very conservative, practical means, Machiavellian style governance, where it's very cutthroat, very duplicitous. types of politics. Duplicitous means like two-faced. I was just watching an interview with Richard Nixon the other day, actually. Richard Nixon's the only president to have resigned the presidency. He stepped down. He would have been impeached, but he resigned the presidency. And what he said was, I don't know if you know anything about Richard Nixon. Actually, his presidential library is very close by. That's over in Yorba Linda. And if you wanted to go check that out, I strongly encourage it. There's some awesome Cold War era, like mid-Cold War era history there. It's super, super cool. But anyway, in this interview, Richard Nixon was saying something to the effect of like, well, I want a president who's going to be kind on the outside and be willing to make the tough decisions on the inside. He kind of talks like that. It's not a great Nixon impression. The same thing, though, he's basically suggesting, right, that your president is somebody. There was a joke. There was a skit on Saturday Night Live, okay, in the 80s, which is long before all your guys' time. And there was a guy that was playing. There used to be a guy on Saturday Night Live when I was a little kid, and his name was Phil Hartman. He actually ended up being murdered by his wife. But anyway, Phil Hartman played Ronald Reagan in this sketch that they did on Saturday Night Live one time. And on this sketch, Ronald Reagan is like it's hard to describe, but if you knew who Ronald Reagan was, he was president in the 80s, and he had this very paternalistic, grandfatherly almost vibe about him, where he was kind of soft-spoken, and he was a former Hollywood actor. He had kind of a kind face. I always thought when I was a kid, because Ronald Reagan looked a lot like my grandfather, and so when I was like 4 and trying to figure out the world, for some reason I thought that like Ronald Reagan was my grandfather because they looked similar. Anyway, to be clear, Ronald Reagan was not my grandfather. But anyway, so in this sketch on Saturday Night Live, Phil Hartman's playing Ronald Reagan, and he's like taking pictures with Girl Scouts, like, well, it's very good to see you. How are you doing today? And he's kind of like soft-spoken. And then the doors close. He's like, all right, let's get to work. And then it's like, now the Soviets are going over here. And he's like really, like behind closed doors, he turns into this whole other like super, super cold warrior sort of guy. And he was like, super stern. And then his like, his aide comes in and she's like, Mr. President, the charity for disabled people is here to take pictures with you. And he's like, darn it, I'm in the middle of something here. And then they come in and he's like, oh, well, it's very good to see you. As you guys have been doing an absolutely wonderful job. And so the point being, duplicitous, two-faced, these are the sorts of politicians that represent realpolitik. And so it seems like probably I just went on some pointless tangent for the last 5 minutes, but the reality is that modern day professional politicians style their governance in the same vein as real politicians did back in the late 1800s. There's a certain pragmatism. There's a certain ruthlessness about how they govern the state, and many of them, much like they did back in the age of realpolitik, wield nationalism as a tool to manipulate people, right? Because nationalism is a powerful way of getting people to support you and get them to ignore differences between you and them. So, for example, most recently, probably the most blatant example of this is exemplified by the Trump presidency, and this isn't a partisan statement. It's just a point of fact where in Trump's 2016 campaign, he used nationalism to get a significant majority of his base to forget about the fact that he really probably on most levels he can't relate to them. He's a billionaire. He was born a billionaire. He's from New York, and his father was a real estate mogul. Most people cannot relate to that at all. It's a completely foreign experience. But if you can wield nationalism to get to say, well, if I love America and you love America, we're the same. That's a really effective way to mobilize the population in your favor. And this is exactly what politicians have been doing for a very long time, and it's what Machiavelli suggested people did, not in the context of nationalism per se, but it's exactly what Machiavelli suggested that people did in The Prince. And two, like the idea that you get, the idea of it's better to be feared than loved, and all of those ideas are Machiavellian as well. And then two, the ends justify the means is another very real politician sort of thing to say, meaning that no matter how cutthroat or ruthless your policies are, if your policies achieve your end goal, then the ends justify the means. It doesn't matter how you got there. Now, I'm not saying that that's a way that an average person should run their life. I mean, that's a pretty horrible thing. But remember that politicians are, they're a different breed of human being in a lot of ways. And a lot of politicians are very, very hard to trust. They're not super trustworthy people because they do what's best for them in that moment. And anytime that somebody acts on that sort of protect myself first, protect my political career first, stay in power first, that means that it's probably not a good idea to trust them. So, Age of Realism. So a new political era emerges where nationalist goals are achieved step by step in Machiavellian fashion. And in France, Emperor Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, would have to cater to liberals in order to maintain effective control. But in Prussia, the liberals are suppressed by Otto von Bismarck. The Crimean War is also one of the first major events that takes place during the Age of Realpolitik. The Crimean War being the first war that's happened since Napoleon. And the Crimean War represents the failure of the concert of Europe. So its credibility was undermined by the failure of the great powers to cooperate during the revolutions of 1848-49. Remember, the whole point of the concert of Europe in the first place was to try to prevent revolutions, more liberal revolutions, from breaking out in Europe, and it works for a while, but by the time that we get to 1848, there's so many revolutions across Europe. There's virtually almost nowhere in Europe that's not experiencing some sort of revolution. Britain and Russia are the two places that don't have a major revolution in 1848. Virtually everywhere else does. Not everywhere else, but most major places in Europe at that time have a major upheaval inspired by liberal idealism and romanticism, except for Britain and Russia, and for opposite reasons. Remember, Britain doesn't have a revolution because, ironically, out of all the places in Europe, they were able to make reforms that ended up ameliorating, smoothing over the concerns, the grievances of the working class folks, who probably would have been most likely to stage some sort of revolt against the government. So the fact that Britain averts a major revolutionary crisis comes because of a completely unforeseen aspect in the age of realpolitik, which is that Britain starts to make steady reform, voting rights, you name it. And then Russia, of course, doesn't have a major revolution for the very opposite reason. It's because they're super autocratic. It's under the rule of Nicholas the First at that time. Remember Anon, Alex the First, Nicholas the First, Alex the Second, Alex the Third, Nicholas the Second, and he's the last one. So, causes of the Crimean War. All right, well, the major cause is because of, basically, you got a dispute between two groups of Christians over privileges in the Holy Land in Palestine, which was an area that was slowly, so Palestine and Palestine is in the area controlled by the Ottoman Empire, right? And the Ottoman Empire is the sick man of Europe. So the Ottoman Empire's grip is slowly loosening on extended regions of its empire, such as Greece, which it lost control of in 1832, and then keep it down. I'm trying to teach over here. And then also down in the Middle East, extended down into this Arabian Peninsula and stuff like that. So let's see here. So, okay. In 1852, the Turks, who are the ones who control Palestine, basically agree to Napoleon III from France, who demanded to provide enclaves in the Holy Land for the protection of Roman Catholic religious orders in the Holy Land. Okay, and this seemingly seemed to jeopardize a previously existing agreement that the Turks had with Russia and Greece pertaining to rights of Eastern Orthodox worshippers of the Christian faith in the Holy Land. So it's a dispute between Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, essentially. Tsar Nicholas I at that time ordered Russian troops to occupy several Turkish-controlled provinces along the Danube River further up in Europe. Remember, Palestine's a long way away from the Danube. All right. And Russia basically says, look, if you don't want these troops stationed in your lands along the Danube, then you can withdraw. Then we will withdraw them once you guarantee the rights for Orthodox Christians in the Holy Land. And so the Turks declare war on Russia in 1853 because Nicholas I refuses to withdraw his troops from the Danubian provinces. And in 1854, Britain and France declare war against Russia. And to some, this is kind of a major surprise because you would think that because they're both Christian, that they would have, gotten along with when I say they're both Christian, I mean Britain and France on one side and Russia both of them are Christian. They're just different denominations of Christianity. You would think that they would get along with one another, but it's kind of a surprise that the Brits and the French take the side of the Turks in this particular scenario, and that's partly because they don't want to see from a political standpoint. And this is where there's always a deeper meaning than just the religious side of things. It's not just about the religion. Typically, there's something else going on. A lot of people you can point to, for example, the example with, it hasn't been in the news as much lately because of the whole COVID thing, but all the global terrorism stuff, okay? Is it partly rooted in religion? Yeah, it's partly rooted in religion, but it's also partly rooted in socioeconomics and opportunity and politics and, but you always follow the dollar trail. That's my recommendation to you. So the question here is, what's the dollar trail? Well, the dollar trail in the Crimean War is if Russia is able to if Russia is able to to be allowed to occupy more and more and more territories and chip away at the lands of the Turks, then this is going to put them in a position to potentially become, a greater threat that might allow them to have more ports and enable them to trade more easily and so on. And it would put them in a position to become an up-and-coming power because of their sheer size. And so Britain and France have a vested interest in trying to contain Russian expansionism in the 19th century. So if you ask me, I mean, we can all point to the religious causes of the Crimean War, but at the end of the day, really this very quickly turns into if it was about the religion, if it was truly about the religion, the French and the Brits wouldn't have taken the sides of the Turks. This was about preventing Russian expansionism and aggressiveness. And so the Crimean War breaks out and Russia loses this war. The 4 points, that were negotiated is that Russia had to renounce its claims to occupied principalities in the Danube. Navigation in the mouth of the Danube River on the Black Sea was going to be international. Russia couldn't claim it as their own. And then Russia also had to renounce its special role of Greek Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. So if you want to be kind to Russia, you can say, well, they were just doing what they were supposed to do to protect the interests of the Greeks, who they had agreed and made a promise to protect their religious rights. That's if you're giving the benefit of the doubt to Russia. If you're being a little bit more critical of Russia, this is an opportunistic play at trying to grab land and move into new areas that they didn't previously occupy and chip away at what is really becoming a very weakened Ottoman Empire by the time that we get to the late 19th century. Folks, I have to go blow my nose, and I'm going to also pour myself a cup of coffee, so I'll be back in about 3 minutes. Much better. So, that's the Crimean War for you in a nutshell. Okie dokie. Okay, where did I leave off over here? So most of the fighting in this war is on the Crimean Peninsula, which is southern Ukraine in modern day times. The Crimean Peninsula is in the Black Sea. And in modern times, Russia has essentially taken over Crimea. Okay, over 50,000 British and French troops fought in the Crimean Peninsula against Russian forces seeking to take over the Black Sea port city of Sebastopol. And then Florence Nightingale was a British nurse who distinguished herself during the Crimean War by becoming kind of a leading figure in modern nursing. During the Crimean War, though, more men died of disease than by combat wounds, and it was Nightingale's Light Brigade that superbly tended to men during the war. Okay, France, Second French Republic. Talking a little bit about President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He was seen by voters as a symbol of stability and greatness due to his distant relation to the former Napoleon the First. And he was dedicated to law and order. He opposed socialism. If I was to characterize Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's reign, he starts off with kind of a stranglehold grip on things, and then over time loosens his grip a bit. So Louis Napoleon starts off very conservative. He was very opposed to socialism, very opposed to radicalism, favored the conservative classes, the church, army, property owners, and businesses. And he did this as a realpolitik move because he's hoping to get their support. He needs their support if he wants to win this election. So he had lived much of his life outside France and thus had very little political baggage to rally opponents. Voters were probably swayed by the legend of Napoleon's greatness and stability that they hope that he would provide. And in return for support from these conservatives, Louis Napoleon had to make some concessions. All right, so the Falloux laws was a very good example of this, where Louis Napoleon returned the control of the education system in France to the church, because the church agreed to give him support. Does he want to do that? No, he does not want to give the church control over anything in France. He wants to be the one in control. However, concessions must be made. And once again, you think about the ends justify the means, right? So if the ends are, hey, I need to get elected into office and become president of France and eventually emperor of France, he's going to temporarily allow the church to control the education system so that he can gain their support in the short term to meet his long-term goals. That's a classic realpolitik move. In modern day times, people do this all the time. Think about the kinds of promises that candidates make on when they're in their election cycle. Well, if you vote for me, I promise to give all Americans whatever. If you vote for me, I promise everybody will have, free health care. Or if you vote for me, I promise, college tuitions will go down. Politicians do this all the time. They make short-term promises to people, and then for long-term support, okay? And this is exactly what Louis Napoleon Bonaparte does. Now, he also supported policies favorable to the army. He disenfranchised a lot of poor folks from voting, and destroyed the kind of democratic socialist movement that was going on there by jailing or exiling its leaders and closing down labor unions. So, like I say, Louis Napoleon really starts off pretty conservative, pretty stranglehold grip on things, very stern, we'll say. But as time goes on, and he plots his coup to become emperor, because remember, the Second French Republic, which was what he was the president of, didn't allow for re-election. And so when he realizes he's not going to be able to bargain his way into getting reelected, he just says, well, that's cool. I'll just overthrow the government then. I'll just pull a Napoleon, as it were. So the Second Empire took place, and this is sometimes called the Liberal Empire. Now, wait a second, Mr. Knight. I thought you said that Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was a conservative. I did, and he is. But as time goes on, he loosens his grip up. And so they sometimes call this the Liberal Empire because of the willingness that Louis Napoleon has to make reforms in France as time goes on. So he took control of the government in a coup d'etat in December of 1851 and became emperor the following year. He restores universal suffrage in 1852, and 92% of the people voted to make him president for 10 years. So he pulls a classical Napoleon move, which is like what the original Napoleon did, which is overthrow the government and then hold a vote on if people support him or not. Which is really funny to do. It's like I've said in class before. It's like if I bought everybody pizza for lunch, we eat lunch, and then I say, how many people want pizza for lunch? And you're like, well, we just had pizza for lunch. So, yes. Anyway, so this is what Napoleon does. Napoleon III now. Napoleon III overthrows the government, restores universal suffrage, and he's like, let's have a vote. Who wants me to be president for 10 years? And they're like, well, yeah, you overthrew the government, so sure. In 1853, 97% of voters agreed to make him a hereditary emperor. So this is kind of, again, it's representing conservatism, but what are some of the liberal things that he does? Well, he sets out to initiate a series of reforms in France, and this demonstrates how the government could kind of reconcile both popular and conservative forces through authoritarian nationalism. He's binding people together in their sense of Frenchness. And this allows him to be able to, bridge the gap between the populist forces and the conservative forces in France. And it goes to show you that nationalism and conservatism are much better together with one another than liberalism and nationalism were. Economic reforms resulted in a healthy economy developing France. They're building new infrastructure, roads, railroads, canals. They're widening the streets. That was where you had that Baron von Haussmann guy who helped to completely redesign the city of Paris. And they start making more movements towards free trade. So French exports double. Inside about 10 years or so. They sign a liberal trade agreement with Britain during this time. They establish the Credit Mobilier, which is a national bank of France during that time. There's new projects that they're developing outside of France, like the Suez Canal and various projects that they're working on with Russia later on. That's post-Crimean War. And then political reforms. He's making new reforms, and he ends up taking once again the power of the education system away from the church and establishing a public education system in France. Permits trade unions to strike. Eased censorship up. So again, these are all the things, like, now that Napoleon is going to be in his position for a while, he loosens his grip and actually initiates a series of liberal reforms from the top down, and people are pretty pleased with it. They're pretty happy with it. He supports better housing. He supports the regulation of pawn shops and credit unions and all sorts of things. So, foreign policy struggles result in strong criticism, though, of Napoleon III. So he's a domestic success, but kind of a foreign failure. So there's a few things that he does that end up resulting in him drawing some criticism. French involvement in the Crimean War definitely angered a number of Republicans and liberals, which are often the same group at that time, which I know probably sounds weird because we think of Republicans in modern time as being conservatives, but that's a totally different kind of Republican than I'm talking about. I'm talking about Republicans who simply support the idea of voting to put representatives in office. I'm not talking about the Republican political party. So French involvement in the Crimean War angered Republicans and liberals. The issue of colonialism in northern Africa became a problem for a while because there's a number of people in France that are anti-imperialist. They don't want the French to go and be involved in other places. And you could say that probably some of the reforms that Napoleon III was doing in France at that time were to divert attention away from a number of kind of bungled foreign policy measures that he had. Let me see, am I missing anything here? The biggest issue, the biggest problem that France had in foreign policy comes when there's a war between France and Prussia, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, and the Franco-Prussian War results in a French loss, right? So that's probably, and also the capture of Napoleon III and the end of the Second French Empire. It's after that they start to establish the French Third Republic and so on and so on. But France goes through a period of time there where it's quite chaotic after the Franco-Prussian War. Okay, next major thing that we got to talk about when it comes to the age of realpolitik is Italian unification. So, if you remember, there was a guy, his name was Giuseppe Mazzini. Giuseppe Mazzini was the French idealist, Italian, the Italian idealist romantic who attempted to unify Italy in the 1848 years, but it doesn't pan out. And Italy remains fragmented until a little bit later. So after the collapse of the revolutions of 1848, a unification movement in Italy shifted to the state of Sardinia-Piedmont under King Victor Emmanuel. And you probably remember this. This was some of the last stuff that we learned about before the COVID thing broke out. Realpolitik was used during the reign of King Victor Emmanuel II because Count Cavour, who was his top minister, advocated for a Machiavellian approach, practical, pragmatic politics that would lead to Italy becoming unified. So Count Camilo Benso di Cavour, Camillo, actually it is Camillo. It looks like it would be Camillo, but it is, they don't, the two L's in Italian are pronounced Camillo. Camilo Benso Cavour. So 1810 to 1861 of Sardinia-Piedmont led the struggle for Italian unification. He's kind of the equivalent of the Bismarck of Italy, but less conservative. Cavour is a little bit more liberal. Not liberal, but he's moderate. He's a moderate nationalist. and he's somewhat aristocratic, actually. So he replaced the earlier failed unification revolutionaries such as Mazzini and the Young Italy movement that tried to and failed to unify Italy using romantic illusions and stuff. And Cavour carries out Realpolitik approach. He's the editor of Il Risorgimento, a newspaper arguing that Sardinia-Piedmont should be the foundation of a new unified Italy. So he kind of guides Sardinia-Piedmont into a liberal, economically viable state in northern Italy. And he did this kind of by modeling some of his policies, actually, after Napoleon, after the French Constitution of the 1830s. And he reforms the judicial system. He built new infrastructure, roads, canals, and so on. The Sichardi law, which sought to reduce the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, was another part of Camilo Benso di Cavour's policies. And Cavour sought unity for the northern and central areas of Italy. The southern areas of Italy tend to fall more under the jurisdiction of a different guy named Garibaldi. Okay, Giuseppe Garibaldi, I believe. And Garibaldi is going to kind of, I guess, liberate but also unite southern Italy. And then northern Italy and central Italy are largely going to be unified by Cavour. And then the question was going to be who of those two guys is going to end up, being the top dog, if you will. And it ends up being Cavour. Well, not really Cavour. Cavour hated Giuseppe Garibaldi, but King Victor Emmanuel ends up being the top dog. Garibaldi submits to this royal figure and says, look, I'm not going to pose a problem. Southern Italy is yours. Unification's the most important, goal here. So another aspect of this, 1855, they joined Britain and France in the Crimean War. And in 1859, there was something created called the Palumbi Air. And this was a promise from Napoleon III, actually, that France would support a Sardinian war with Austria for the creation of a northern Italian kingdom controlled by Sardinia. But in return, what does France get? Well, they would get Savoy and Nice. Well, Austria declares war on Sardinia in 1859 after being provoked, and then France supports Cavour in return for receiving those territories, but then backs out. So the Palumbi Air, if you don't remember, is when it was one of those bungled foreign policies by Napoleon III, where he made a promise to the Italians and then he kind of just bails on it at the last second because he doesn't want to get himself involved in a war with Austria. So unification. Sardinia-Piedmont gained Lombardy, but not Venice as a result of its war with Austria. France does briefly come to their aid and then says, peace out, we're going back home. They back out of the Palumbi Air Agreement. And then 1860, Cavour arranged the annexation of Parma, Modena, Romagna, and Tuscany into Sardinia. Let's see here. Anything else that I'm missing on that part? Okay. So, Giuseppe Garibaldi liberated southern Italy and Sicily. Garibaldi exemplified the romantic nationalism of Mazzini and earlier Young Italy revolutionaries. And in May of 1860, Garibaldi and his Red Shirts, that was the name of the followers of Garibaldi, landed in Sicily and extended the nationalist activity to the south. Now, by September of 1860, Garibaldi took control of Naples and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies as well. Now, Cavour doesn't trust Garibaldi, but Victor Emmanuel II encourages Garibaldi's exploits in southern Italy, and Cavour insists that Sardinia be the foundation of Italian nationalism, not Garibaldi's vision for the South. And so Garibaldi was kind of allowed by Victor Emmanuel II to kind of continue doing his little conquests and then eventually be absorbed into Sardinia Piedmont. So in February of 1861, Victor Emmanuel ends up becoming King of Italy. So he is now Victor Emmanuel the first King of Italy, rather than Victor Emmanuel II, King of Piedmont, Sardinia. And presided over an Italian parliament which represented all of Italy except for Rome, which was controlled by the Papal States at the time, and Venice, which was still controlled by Austria at the time. So those are the last two areas that are not under the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of Italy. And in 1866, Venice was incorporated into the Italian kingdom as a result of an alliance with Bismarck, who went to war with Austria in 1866. And Italy joined in on Bismarck's side and was given the concession of Venice as a token of respect from Bismarck. And then in 1871, Rome is captured by Italian troops and became the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. So 1871, Rome is pulled in as well. So it's not going to be too much later that Venice and Rome get absorbed into the Kingdom of Italy. But at first, they're not a part of it. And then German unification is the last little part here. And so German unification under the Hohenzollern dynasty of Prussia. The question here is Grossdeutsch plan versus Kleindeutsch plan. Grossdeutsch, gross like gross domestic product, we're going to go ahead and take in Austria. Kleindeutsch, we're going to decline Austria, right? That's how you can remember that. Otto von Bismarck is the leader of this. He's a Junker. In other words, he's a Prussian noble. He's a military dude. He's obsessed with power. And he believes in this thing called gap theory, which is that if there's ever a crisis, a stalemate between the king and the legislature, there's a gap that wasn't mentioned if a stalemate develops, and he uses this as a tool to be able to create stalemates, right? Create stalemates that allow for the king to act in a more despotic fashion, a more absolutist fashion. So since the king had been the one who granted the Constitution, in Bismarck's view, this gap in the Constitution where there was no mention of what to do in the case of a stalemate meant that by de facto the power goes to the king because he's the one who had granted the Constitution in the first place. And so Bismarck insisted that the middle class basically gets ignored. And you know, his famous quote was that the great questions of the day would be answered by blood and iron, okay, not by speeches or resolutions. So he's a man of action. But the way that he goes about governing is in a very he uses war in a very specific way. It's not like waging large-scale wars or anything like that. What he's trying to do is use war like a surgical scalpel to like take little pieces of land away from places, and he's ruthless. I mean, but the man is a genius, and he's the undisputed champion at international diplomatic chess in Europe for about 30 years. From about 1850 to about 1880 or so. So he oversaw a number of reforms that improved the Prussian military. Leave it to a guy like Bismarck to make all of the reforms that he doesn't want to make in the interest of keeping his power. He makes certain reforms in Prussia, in Germany eventually, because he unifies Germany. But he makes these reforms in Germany that are really interesting, because you would think to himself, well, he's a conservative. Why would he be making these policies for the working class. What does he care about them? He doesn't. He cares about his power. And so he's not doing it because he likes the working class. He's not passing laws to help people out because he feels bad for them or something like that. He's passing laws because he'd rather that he's the one that gets credit for doing something than to allow somebody to get angry at him for not taking action, and then somebody else to take the credit for, putting into practice the policies that he could have done himself. So all of Bismarck's moves are about taking credit for reforms that he really doesn't want to make, but he does it in the interest of staying in power and undercutting all of his competition's ability to make claims against him. You can't complain about a guy who is passing all of the laws that your party allegedly wants to pass, right? And it's like, well, I guess we got what we wanted, you can't. I mean, it had to just be infuriating for his political opponents, because they're the ones taking credit for the he's the one taking credit for policies that they've probably been advocates of for years and actually really wanted to be able to put into place, but he doesn't let them have that opportunity because he's always 4 or 5 steps ahead of everybody else. So Bismarck's a genius. And he wages 3 small wars but significant wars. One against the Danes, one against the Austrians, and one against the French. And the way that he goes about waging war is rather clever as well, because he doesn't want to be perceived as the bad guy. He doesn't want to be perceived as an international aggressor. So what he does is he goads other places into war, which is what he did in the case of France with something called the Alms Dispatch, which is this thing that was intentionally meant to humiliate, upset, and infuriate Napoleon III of France, and it worked. And so France declares war against Prussia, which is exactly what it's like setting a trap. Okay, Bismarck was a master trap setter, because he'd set a trap and he'd lure people into it. War with France is exactly what he wanted to have happen, because he's like, now the trap is sprung, now we can come at them, and that's exactly what they do. And it shows that the Prussians defeat in 1871 is definitely a far cry from the France of Napoleon's days, back in the Napoleon I's days. And they also claim land. Alsace and Lorraine go over to Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. That would remain a bitter, bitter, bitter loss for France all the way through World War I, where after they defeat the Germans in World War I, they take back that territory. And so anyhow, German Empire is proclaimed on January 18th, 1871. Napoleon III is out of power. Wilhelm I became Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm I, and then he is replaced by Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, there is a Reichstag still, 2 houses, 2-house Reichstag. You've got the Bundesrat and the Bundestag. And but in reality, the Reichstag really doesn't have much power, because the German Empire became a conservative, autocratic-styled government with nobles running the show, particularly Bismarck, who were allied with the monarch himself. So, although they do have a democratic institution, the degree to which that democratic institution has any ability or governing power is very much curtailed by the nobles in charge. Okay. Last but not least, Austria. So there was something called the Ausgleich, or Compromise, of 1867. This officially creates the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So now it's Austria-Hungary. It's a hyphenated name. Hungarians now had their own assembly, cabinet, administrative system, and would support and participate with Austria in the imperial army and in the imperial government. And Austria assimilated the Hungarians, the Magyars, and nullified them as a primary opposition group, which led to a more efficient government. But nationalism is going to be a thorn in the side of Austria, because as time goes on, more and more and more, these nationalistic sentiments start to percolate in Austria, and people, nationalism ends up being a fragmenting force for Austria-Hungary that results in the crisis in the Balkans, leading to World War I, which is one of the very last things we talked about. I think it was the last thing that we talked about before being released from school a couple months ago, was the crises in the Balkans. That was just the next thing I was going to teach. The next class was going to be the sandwich story, which I never ended up getting to. But maybe when the AP test is over next week, I can tell you the sandwich story. So, also at this time, we're seeing anti-Semitism increasingly in particularly Eastern Europe, because of the pogroms and other things like that that are being conducted against Jewish communities in Russia and in Eastern Europe. So anti-Semitism was profound also in Austria. Jewish populations in Austrian cities grew rapidly because with the Ausgleich, the 1867 compromise, Jews had gained equal legal rights as everybody else. So many Jewish businesses and so on were very successful, and you start to see Jewish artists and intellectuals and scientists emerge, like, for example, Freud, and then Einstein is Jewish, and various others. So German extremists charged Jews with controlling the economy and corrupting German culture with alien ideas and ultra-modern art. And then the Magyars in Hungary, basically only the wealthiest 25% of males had the right to vote in Hungary. There were laws promoting the use of the Hungarian language in schools and government. And they get resented by now other minorities in that territory, because Austria-Hungary, even though now the Hungarians are being represented, the other minorities are not. So you have a number of other Slavic minorities, Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and so on, who don't have the representation, and now they're just being forced to learn yet another language that they don't view to be a part of their culture. So this brings us to the end of the Age of Realpolitik review, but tune in Monday for the final review session before the AP exam on the Age of Mass Politik, leading up to and imperialism. So Age of Mass Politik and Imperialism is going to be our last review session before the AP exam next, Wednesday, I think it is. And remember that the AP exam is a DBQ. So today's review assignment is going to be pertaining to writing on the Age of Realpolitik, and I will make sure to put that up on Schoology by about noon today. I have a lot of fish to fry today, so I'm going to try and get that up as soon as I can, but I've got like a lot of things I got to do. But I'll make sure to give you enough time to get it done, and all the instructions will be perfectly clear, but I think I can get it up by noon. So long as everything goes smoothly with everything else. I got to meet with a bunch of people on Zoom and do some other things today. So anyhow, folks, thanks so much for tuning in this morning. I hope that this review on the Age of Realpolitik has been helpful for you. And if you have any questions, send me a message. All right, folks. Have a great day.